Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. So I'm back with another custom order video, and I'll be basically showing you the process I go through to make any custom order. But before I carry on, please like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet. The first thing I do when it comes to custom orders is to sketch the design. My client this time is actually one of my friends, and she asked me to make a dress for her birthday. So while I'm sketching the dress, I'll be telling you the specific requirements that my client wants her dress to have. I'll start by discussing the front part of the dress. So she wants the neckline to have a V neckline, and it will also have 2 pleats on the left side of her breast area, while also having another 2 pleats on the right side of the waist area. She also wanted a ruffle connected below the breast area, and also the length of the ruffle should be knee length. So now I'll move on to the back part of the dress. She wants the back part of the dress to have straps that tie in a crisscross direction, and then the zip she wants is an invisible zipper. And then to make the dress more tailored to her body, I added a 2 pointed dot on both sides at the back. She wanted the length of her dress to be above knee length, and the fabric she wants the dress to be made of is satin. And lastly, she wanted the color of her dress to be magenta. Please keep in mind that some customers will either send you a picture of the dress they want you to make, or sometimes they'll even personally ask you to design the dress for them. And this is how the sketch turned out. After finalizing the design with my client and making sure that she's happy with how it looks, I can now take her measurements and use them to draft the pattern for the dress. So after taking her measurements, I use those measurements to make this custom dress block, both front and back. And then I traced the front block on a new piece of paper. After tracing it, I used it to draft the front part of the dress. After that, I cut out the front pattern pieces and started labeling them. I repeated the same steps for the back pattern pieces. Now that I'm done doing the front and back patterns, I then moved on to the ruffle that's going to be in front. For the ruffle, I basically drafted the pattern, which looks like this. Then I traced it out on paper to make the final pattern, and then I labeled it. Once I was satisfied with the pattern, I cut it out. And here I was folding it just to have an idea of how it's going to look like on the dress. Buying the fabric after creating the pattern helps me estimate how many meters of fabric I need to buy. So I looked through all the pinks they had to offer, and I came across this exact magenta I was looking for. The items I bought was the fabric, the lining, the zip, and the thread. Before I start cutting into the fabric, I had to take the zip and then measure it so that I can make a point where it ends on the pattern. Here's a closer look of how the fabric looks like. I really think this color is amazing, and it's going to complement the skin very well. The next thing to do is to wash the fabric and dry it. After drying it, I can start pinning the pattern on the fabric and then cutting it out. After cutting the back pattern, I started pinning and cutting the front pattern pieces. So now it's time to transfer the 2 pointed dots from the pattern to the fabric, and for that I'll be using my pins. If you guys are looking for a tutorial on how to do a 2 pointed dot, please leave a comment below and I'll do it on my next video. So after pinning the dots in place, I can now take the chalk and file it down to make it nice and sharp. And then I use the chalk to outline the dot, or to basically redraw it. These are all the parts needed to make the dress. So now it's time to cut the lining. And basically I'll be repeating the same steps I did before, which is to pin the pattern on the lining and then start cutting it out until it looks like this. I'm going to start by overlocking all the sides except for the hem. This is to avoid any fraying which causes the seam allowance to shrink or become smaller, which will eventually affect the fit of the dress. When it comes to the lining, I will only overlock the side where I'll be attaching the zip. So now it's time to start stitching the 2 pointed dots on the fabric and also the lining. I've already pinned it in place, and then I always have to make sure that they are the same size or basically identical to each other before I start stitching them in place. Before I can cut out the loose threads on the dots, I first have to tie them into knots, then I can cut them out. This is how the dots look like outside, and then this is how they look like inside of the fabric. Next thing to do is to start stitching the zip on the dress. First thing I'm going to need is the 2 back pieces, then I'll place them like this, and then I'm going to put right sides together and then pin it in place. Then finally I can start stitching the seam allowance for the zip, which is about 2 centimeters. After stitching it, it's gonna end up looking like this, and obviously I had to iron the seam open. Now it's time to take my zip, and then the first thing I'm going to do is to hand stitch the zip in place so that it's easier for when I start stitching it with the machine. So this is how the invisible zip turned out. I really love how it looks, and I'm just happy with the result. So now it's time to pin the 2 pleats that are going to be around the breast area and also the other pleats that are going to be around the waist area. Now it's time to stitch the pleats in place so that they don't move around. Now I can move on to pinning and also cutting out my ruffle. This is how it looks after pinning and cutting it, and then the next thing I did was to pin the ruffle together like this just to see how it's going to look when it's on the dress. And then once I was happy with how it looks like, I actually had to iron it in place so that it doesn't lose its shape. And then I had to pin it in place in the middle of both of the 2 front pieces. After pinning it all together here, I can start by stitching everything in place. And then for the lining, I just pinned the front and 2 back pieces together and stitched them in place. So while I was cutting the fabric for the straps, I realized that I was cutting it in the wrong direction, so I had to redo it again and cut them on bias. So after fixing the strap issue, I started sewing them in place and then trimmed the excess fabric from them. Then after that, I used my loop turner to turn them inside out. So after creating the straps, I can now use them for the front part of the dress, and here I'm just pinning them in place. And I also cut out 2 smaller ones to pin them at the back of the dress. So after pinning my straps on the dress in place, I took my lining and started pinning it to the front and also back part of the dress. And then when I made sure that all the seams match and I'm satisfied with how the dress looked, I can start stitching it in place. So after stitching the lining to the dress, I actually had to do quality control, which is to basically check the dress itself, check if the straps are strong enough, and also check if the zip is working, because the next thing to do is to take it to my client and do fittings. And also keep in mind the dress itself is not entirely done, because she still has to tell me what she wants to change and all of that. Fitting the dress on my clients is the most important part of the process. There were some changes I had to make, and the first thing I'm going to begin with is the front part of the dress. The first thing I have to do is to make the neckline smaller around this area where I pinned, and also on the other side. Then after making the neckline smaller, I have to lower the straps too. After fixing the top area of the dress, I can move on to the sides. I think it's always better to make the dress bigger than small, so that I can always take the side seams in to make it fit better. So for the ruffle, she asked me to make it hang and not attached to the dress. And also when it's attached to the dress, I noticed that it didn't have any movement while she was walking. So I think it will be better if it hangs. And then I have to add lining to the ruffle, but instead of using the lining fabric for it, I'll be using the satin fabric since it's gonna be visible. And then for the hem, I think it's also better to make it longer than shorter, so that your client is able to tell you which length she desires. If it's too long for her, you can make it shorter, but you can't make it longer if it's already too short. Now we can move on to the back part of the dress, and I honestly didn't have to change a lot of things here. The first thing I had to change here is the strap placement. Where the straps are situated right now are creating this ripple effect, which doesn't look good at all. So I'll be moving them from this side to here, which will create less of a ripple effect. And just like I've mentioned before, I'll also be taking in the size of the dress so that it can fit her better. And then I noticed that on the top part of the zip, both sides were separated or basically apart. So to fix that, I'll be adding a hook and eye. And lastly, I'll be taking in the hem to make the dress a little bit shorter as she requested. So before I took out the pins while she was wearing the dress during fittings, I actually had to use my fabric marker to make these marks of where I pinned on the dress. The marks basically act like a guideline for where I need to stitch the new seam. After marking the new guideline, I had to cut out the excess fabric so I can stitch the new side seams together. So finally we've reached the end of the video, and this is how the dress turned out. The dress really looks amazing on her, and I also think the color complements the skin tone very well. I just honestly think she looks stunning in this dress, and most importantly, she was really happy about it. And also my favorite part about this dress is the ruffle. So please let me know what you guys think of how the dress turned out by leaving a comment. Thank you so much for watching this video, and please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to my channel.